Hi,
Hey, Steve.
Steve.
How you doing, buddy?
I'm all right. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Good, good.
Getting ready for I leave town next Tuesday and
Uh,
I'll be gone for 3 months. Got a nice little itinerary brewing.
I saw, yeah, you're going to the East and Australia. Is that right?
We kick off in China. I have some other things. I have the concert in Finland
Uh-huh.
with the Tampa Day Orchestra, and uh and that's um that's on the 15th of
Uh-huh.
September. And then I'm going to go to Holland. I'm researching a project that should turn out to be pretty cool.
Oh, really? Can you give us
Yeah,
any
I can't
clues?
really talk about it yet, but
Ah, okay.
it would be it's really cool. And yeah, then we kick off. We have 9 shows in China,
Mhm.
and then it's Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Jakarta, Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand. It's a pretty robust.
Yeah.
All gone.
That's great. So, yeah, I mean, since the last time we spoke, I've been looking at the guitar part for Alien Orifice, and
Yeah.
I thought it'd be interesting to do an analysis on the guitar part during the interlude there.
Hmm.
Just approaches to the rhythm and technical considerations, things like that,
Hmm.
and also the section that follows it, which is essentially made up of these little one bar melodic phrases that get modified and transformed throughout the section.
Yeah.
Um, I guess in order to support the analysis, it'd be great if we could discuss some background information, perhaps. When we spoke last, you mentioned that Frank had given you the chart on an airplane and had inserted those contentious septuplets. Um, I just wondered if you could talk us through the development of the piece, I guess, from the moment you got the chart through to rehearsals, performances, and the recording stage.
The best that I can remember is almost half a century ago.
It's a big ask. Any
Yeah, no
information?
worries. There's one thing I wanted to clarify. I watched a little bit of our interview, and I think it's great.
Yeah, me too.
Was discussing how Frank would give me a score, and I might find some things in it. It's important to point out that there's back then there was quite a process when you would compose. A composer would compose on paper by hand usually, well, not usually, but always. And then they hand it off to a copyist, and the copyist then takes it and by hand they would do calligraphy onto what's known as onion skin or vellum,
Uh-huh.
and that would then be used to print scores and stuff. And Frank had a host of fantastic copyists. There was David Ocker, and there was a couple of others. And in this process, there's always mistakes that happen.
Mhm.
So when I would point out mistakes, the vast majority of the time, it was in the copying. And it's just natural. This happens. That's why Frank would write, this is an early print, so there might be some errors.
Sure.
Uh, I was talking about how I found this line that the horn was out of range, and that was a copyist thing, I
Mhm.
believe.
Mhm.
So Frank rarely made any mistakes.
Sure.
It wasn't his errors.
Sure. No, that's an important clarification to make, Steve, and I appreciate
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And it's not like I was the note police on Frank's music.
No, of course not. Of course not. No, I mean, copy and errors do occur. It's
Yeah,
part of the
it's
process.
just part of the process.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So Alien Orifice, Frank was constantly composing and various kinds of compositions. Sometimes he would kind of go underground for a little while and compose orchestra scores. And I know that he loved composing for his bands.
Mm.
And based on the instrumentation of the band he had at a particular time, would dictate the kind of score he wrote for the band. But with Frank, it was any means necessary. He would sometimes come in with a completed score for the band. And then at times he would in rehearsals teach us things, show us things, and create a piece of music that could ostensibly sound as though every note was composed. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It was any means necessary. And then it wasn't uncommon. Well, it was relatively uncommon for him to give a piece of music that was from a score that he wrote for the band and change it. He would do that not very often, but constantly. He would be editing, rearranging, dropping parts in of all sorts of things, you know. So
Sure.
Alien Orifice came as just a piece of sheet music, and then that was enough. And it would have the chord symbols and the melody. That score you sent, it looks suspiciously like Frank's calligraphy, but it doesn't, because it's on the it looks as though it was put on vellum, onion skin.
I understand.
So but inevitably it started out as just Frank sitting and composing, and he composed all the time. He had a little briefcase, and he'd open it up, you'd open it up, and it'd be, you know, a little cassette recorder, the portable ones at the time, manuscript paper, pens, pencils, and cigarettes, you know, something like that. And we'd get right to an airport. He'd sit, open up his briefcase, start writing, get on the airplane, sit, start writing. You know what I mean? He never really, very rarely squandered potential composition time.
Yeah.
And I believe that Alien Orifice came from something like that. And my observations, when he would compose something like this, he would sit at the piano, and I might assume that Alien Orifice arose like this, where he would sit at the piano and he'd play a chord and he'd plunk out a melody, and then he'd compose it and, you know, play a chord, plunk at the melody. So when he handed that to me on the plane, I didn't know how much of that he had potentially composed while sitting at home or in an airport. But I know he gave it to me, and I looked at it, and I always got very excited when Frank gave me music, you know, because in all of my naivete, innocence, inexperience, intimidation that I felt just by being around Frank, that always floated my boat. When Frank gave me an assignment or gave me a piece of music, it was like, you know, I just sharpened my knives. I was ready to go, you know. And the more obtuse it was, the better, you know. And Alien Orifice was one of those pieces of music that was melodic and yet very compositional. I remember receiving Envelopes. Envelopes was a composed score for the band. I mean, he had various different kinds of orchestrations for it. I know that there's an orchestra score,
That's right.
but I received a part that said guitar, you know, and that was more of an obtuse kind of a melody. But Alien Orifice was one of those pieces where Frank had an incredible melodic heart. You know, there's so many jewels and little gems in his composition. Uncle Meat, you know, it's so beautiful. So much of his melodic composition for rock band especially was just beautiful. It's just inspired, you know.
Brilliant.
And then there was like in between stuff where it was a little out there, still beautiful, you know, or a little ugly. And then there was, you know, Frank loved writing ugly sometimes, you know. So Alien Orifice was one of those. It wasn't sofa, you know, it wasn't strictly genteel. It was a compositional piece. And I believe it was just the chords and the melody. And that little incident on the plane, I remember I was looking at it, getting very excited, trying to figure out how am I going to finger this, and running the rhythms in my head. And then I always had questions with articulation because the guitar, when you write articulation into a piece of guitar music, the articulation means something different than it does for other instruments.
Mm.
You know, an accent, a slur, a trill, you know, these kinds of, well, a trill is relatively conventional, but guitar music has certain idiosyncrasies.
Mhm.
And when Frank would write it and hand a lead sheet, it wasn't specific to a guitar, it was just a melody. So I would have questions. Well, how, do you want this attacked? Because the way it's written, this is an accent, but every note that's not under a slur, you know, as I mentioned before, was
Mhm.
technically, to do it as written, would be a picked note. So as I'm sitting there looking at them, how am I going to? Oh, yeah. Okay, so this on one occasion I went up to the, you know, first class, and I sat with Frank, and we reviewed it a little bit. And I said, how, you know, what about this? And you know, he looked at it, he said, and then he took it, and that's when he wrote those crazy septuplets. And you know, I thought, oh, I should have stayed in my seat. uh, but it always excited me. And when I got home and I started to, well, I can't remember when I started learning it. It might have been on a tour or when I got back home. But it was always a challenge to find the right positions because, you know, the guitar is a fickle instrument for reading music. Sight reading on the guitar is just, it's very difficult because you have to understand the best placement, and you have to, when I was in the positions where I had to sight read something, you always have to read it through in your head first and imagine or create how you're going to get to various fret positions
Yeah,
to get to particular notes, you know. And sight reading, it's Frank's music, it just it's too obtuse, you know. There's intervals of like, you know, tenths and stuff, you know. And so it really required a study. And I studied Alien Orifice, and that was a kind of piece that when we finally got into rehearsal, he manually orchestrated it.
Mhm.
And if you listen to the recording, you can hear that although there's just one melody, sometimes I'm playing it, sometimes somebody else is playing it, sometimes two people are playing, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Sometimes the chords are done this way, sometimes a vocal might come in and do something. So it was really a different compositional approach for him because he would manually build something from a lead sheet as opposed to handing in a score.
Mhm.
And the funny thing, he got such a kick out of hearing it, you know, and you always knew because he would kind of like smile when if it was being played, performed properly. Are you a composer? You're a composer, right? So
Yeah.
you know how there's some little button that gets pushed in a composer when there's wrong notes. You know, it's like, no, that's not my soul. You're ruining my soul. Whatever it is, you know, that's like, and Frank was, you know, he wanted his music played right,
Of course.
and it got rehearsed. It became part of the set list, and he could call on it anytime. And that was one of the ones that you just never know. Days could go by, maybe a week before it was put into the set list again. But I had to play it every day.
Mhm.
For me on the guitar, it's not like, hey, do you remember Alien Orifice? Let's play that. Yeah, no thanks. You know, that's actually a reoccurring nightmare that I've had for decades. It's one of these funny kind of situations where I find myself walking onto Frank's stage, and there's like Alien Orifice, The Black Page, Maggio, and it's like, I'm Frank. It was 45 years ago. I don't remember this, you know. And he's like, well, you got to play it, you know. And then he starts the downbeat, and then I wake up, you know. That's like a total
Recurring nightmare.
that feeling of ah.
Yeah.
But so I had to keep all these things under my fingers.
Yeah.
Once it got out there and we were performing a song like that, he would occasionally tweak it, but he would usually conduct it.
Mm.
So, okay, let's start that segment again.
That's fine, no problem. So what was yeah, the chords that are written in the charts, you don't
Yeah.
hear them in the actual recordings. Um, and I did the Mogio video a while back, and I just out of interest, I played the chords while I played the melody, just out of curiosity, and it kind of sounded nice, a little bit obvious, I suppose. And my deduction, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my deduction would be that maybe he thought that, well, it's too nice with the chords, it's too obvious. Whereas if you just have the melody playing out, it's more ambiguous, more interesting, perhaps.
Sometimes it may start out a particular way in the rehearsal, and then once it got into the recording and the mix, he might do something like that. Take out certain chords, atmospheres, and just leave the melody. Sometimes he wouldn't touch it. You know, it was all based on the composer's ear and what he was hearing at a particular time. But he usually wrote the chord symbols because that was part of his compositional process. And when we were looking at the Alien Orifice chord symbols, I can't tell you because if he wrote chord symbols, it was because he was doing a lead sheet or something. You know, I don't believe that there's a lot of that in the scores. You know, unless it was a band score and he just wanted comping or something.
Yeah.
But when you look at something like Alien Orifice, the intricate chord symbol, I would assume that's because he's sitting at the piano and he's playing these chords, and then he's writing the melody, and then he's looking at the chord and what do I call this?
Yeah.
You know, and when it comes to calling a chord a name, boy, there's as many different opinions of how to do that as there are people that know what chords are. You know what I mean? When you
Yeah.
start getting into the rules or the convention. And I did my best through the years because I always wanted to understand, and I wanted to be correct when I would write something and give it to a musician. You want that voicing a particular way, or you don't. You just want the flavor, and here's the chord. Do what you want with it. So when Frank did a lot of the melodic melody writing and then chord symbols, the symbol represented more of what the atmosphere of the chord's going to be. If Frank wanted a specific voicing, he wrote it out.
Yeah.
He said, play this, you know. And when it comes to the suffixes on a chord, like I said, I did my best to try to create what I thought was the most conventional, practical chord naming library for chord writing. And it's in the Videology book. And I've sent that to so many of my friends that I trust musically, and they had comments, you know, and about, well, I kind of think that this means this. And I sometimes I'd say, well, no, it doesn't. But sometimes I'd say, something like that chord where some composers, and when looking at these suffixes on the chords for Alien Orifice, I'm assuming that the way they're written was probably transcribed from the copyist directly as Frank wrote it.
Sure.
And because they're unconventional the way that he wrote them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it might have been shorthand for him for actual voicings.
Right.
You know, because usually when you're stacking chord symbols, voicings, there's a particular order and they mean certain things. Like if you say, I think if you put a 13th in a chord, conventionally it means a major third, a flat 7, a 9, and the gray area is the 11th.
Yeah.
You know, some people say, well, if it's a 13th, it has to have an 11. And if it has an 11, then that's the sus on the 4.
Yeah.
So there's so many ways, and you'll never know until unless you can go to Frank and say, what do you mean by this?
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
because it's totally unconventional and confusing.
Sure.
Okay. It leaves guys like us trying to figure out what he meant, you know, but I don't think that Alien Orifice is a good representation of chord voicings that Frank wanted to be very specific at,
Mm.
because if it was, he would have written the notes. As far as my experience,
Yeah,
yeah,
no, that sounds correct. And I mean, in the recording, there are no chords during the interlude or the section that follows that. There's
yeah.
chords in the melody. So yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the actually, I heard a recording of you playing it on like a little tape recorder way back in maybe 1981. There's a on YouTube. There's this little audio snippet of you playing it, just the guitar
Oh,
and some
really?
rhythm chords in the background. And I don't know if it's you singing it, but you're like got a munchkin voice in the background singing the melody at the same time that the interlude. You know, does that sound
I
familiar?
see that. I remember now. Oh, and now I remember. Okay. I can tell you about that, but maybe I should take a look at it. Do you mind?
No, I don't mind. No, no.
What do you think it would be under?
I put Steve Vai Alien Orifice.
Oh my God, now I remember.
Is that a trip down memory lane or what?
Corn dog. Okay, so I remember now. Totally slipped my mind. So, yeah, that was 1981. That was right after I got the piece and I got home. A lot of times what I would do when Frank would give me a piece of music is I would learn it and record it and listen to it so that it could be committed to memory.
Mhm.
I was completely fascinated with recording ever since I was a kid, and I understood what I was in 4th grade. I understood what sound on sound recording was. I flipped out, and I knew that I wanted to do that. I remember I would sit and I'd start building. Uh, I'd take like Led Zeppelin songs,
Right.
and I'd say, I'm going to record the bass and the drums on this track, and then we record on that track, and uh, and there was a kid up the street that actually owned a sound on sound tape, a reel to reel. And Joe Satriani had one, and I'd go to lessons, and he had one. Matter of fact, the first thing I ever recorded, the first song I wrote with Joe,
Uh-huh.
and we recorded it on his sound on sound. So I thought one day I got to have a sound on sound recorder. So the right as soon as I moved out to California, I was 20. I was on the prowl. I was saving. I wanted to get a sound. I got a TX 4-track, you know, reel to reel, and also a 2-track. And so that you can bounce. You bounce
Right.
4 tracks to 2, and then
Go back. Yeah. Yeah.
And I had zero understanding of engineering. I mean and recording. I would do things like that solo that was like just one take, because back then my thought pattern was you just do it once. What do you need to do it again for? And and I didn't even have a drum machine. I had nothing to create a rhythm. The first drum machine I received was one that Frank gave me. Actually, it was this like old, really old, I think I still have it. A really old kind of a one of those beat boxes that have like the polka button and the
Yeah.
samba button, and you can hear it on Disco Boy. He used it on Disco
Oh,
Boy.
okay. Okay.
And I traded him a session. I did a recording session, and he said he gave me, we traded. And I was in heaven when I got that stupid little beatbox. I started just every song I wrote had a samba beat. And uh when I got Alien Orifice, I don't know how this got out. I don't know how this was ever
I'm not sure.
released. I mean, I certainly thought it was a well-kept secret in my attic. You see, YouTube has legs. It has
Goblin's going into
radar.
the attic there, and
Yeah, YouTube like reaches out and goes into all these
yeah,
crates and says, "Ha, I got you now." And
thanks.
there you are, 21, year old Steve Vai doing Munchkin vocals on a
I
treacherous
like that.
melody.
I really like that actually. I thought that was really cool. It's quite
Well,
funny.
yeah, so I recorded that, and when it came to that fast melody, uh, boy, when I discovered that you can turn the tape down halfway and slow things down and then get the munchkin,
Yeah.
I just owned that. And uh, also with behind this was also the idea, and then I could take it to Frank, and it'll be the first time he heard his song.
Yeah.
So I must have had that lead sheet. I'm sure I did. And I did the best to make sense of what those chord symbols were. And I put them on one of those tracks.
Mhm.
But yeah, in the final recording, I wouldn't be surprised if there was chords there, but Frank took them out.
Uh, yeah, that sounds plausible. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the other interesting thing about the chords is something Frank Zappa talked about with the sus2 chords. You don't have the major third, so you got a lot more latitude to use melodic notes. And actually, in Alien Orifice, this I've been looking at it today. Matter of fact, there's you'll have like a C sus2, and there's like a Lydian sound. There's a minor third, and then there's like a major third. It's really maximizing the resources from that sus chord. Which was something you
Yeah.
talked about in interviews. So I found that quite fascinating, and it does really open up the sort of another world in terms of creating melodies. Um,
Yeah. Frank liked sus 2 chords. Sometimes he would just write 2
mm,
and not the sus. Um, but you can hear them quite frequently. Uncle Meat, uh, Black Page is all sus 2 chords because it allowed him the latitude of a sparse voicing. Because
yeah,
basically it was, the root, you have the ninth in there and the fifth. And that leads, that allows you to
just
go
opens
to
everything up.
heaven and, with the tensions that you build around it. And he did that a lot.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about Roxy and Elsewhere. Now, I think I'm correct in saying that you transcribed the whole album. Is that right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that happened at a time when I was doing lead sheets for Frank, because when you're in his universe, it's 24/7, or at least when you're not sleeping, you're doing something. And it was fantastic because you might get a call, you go up to the studio, you record, you might, and because I was also a transcriptionist for him, a lot of my spare time was spent on that. I tried to confer with him as minimal as possible. I've gone as far as to try to. I remember once I asked him if it was possible to make me some stems. Like make some tape recordings of just various tracks, because then I could really dig in.
Mhm.
But with the Roxy record, a lot of Zappa fans, I find, cite that record as one of their favorites. It really is a spectacular adventure. That was one of his best bands, and they all of that music was constructed in a way that I believe was Frank composing melodies and then building it with the bands, because he used the colors of the band and the potential and the abilities of the band members to introduce certain music. But the Roxy record was just, wow, man. I listened to it so much. You talk to people that enjoy transcribing, it's almost like they hear a piece of music and they just want to see it on paper, and they want every little detail.
Uh-huh.
So I think I may have mentioned that there was a period where I was designated the responsibility of making sure that all of Frank's songs were represented in some form of manuscript, whether it be a simple lead sheet or whatever. And this was for copyright purposes, so Frank could have everything properly copywritten.
Mhm.
And I know why he hired somebody to do that, because I would love to have something like that, and through the years, I work with Hal Leonard. I am very focused on the folios that we release, because there's a nice feeling for for a person that loves to compose, to know that their music is, you know, fleshed out and on paper. It's
Yeah.
just like a feeling like, okay, now it's immortalized, or
Yeah.
now I have it to look at if I need it or something. So I wanted to offer that to Frank for that record, because technically I only needed to make melodies and chords for that record.
Right.
But there's so much intense musicality there, and such brilliant melody, and a lot of source material, because there was pieces that he wrote, like, the bebop tango, that he didn't like show the band that was like, here's a bebop tango. And that whole side of the record with A Kid in His Arf and Don't You Ever Wash That Thing, and it's just,
Yeah, it's outstanding.
it's fantastic. It's not progressive, it's not heady. I mean, in the conventional sense, it's just Zappa.
Yeah.
you know? So I wanted that on paper. I wanted every little thing. And it was difficult, and I haven't reviewed it in since then, so I don't even know how accurate it might be, because I only had the record to go by and a cassette player,
Okay. Mm.
and my 21-year-old ears, you know. Um which we're still relatively in a sort of infancy. Um but boy, I certainly enjoyed listening and trying to figure it out. And there was one part that I did go to Frank, because I it was inconsistent, and I didn't really understand it. And it's a part in I think it's Don't You Ever Wash That Thing. Something wasn't quite right. And I thought, I think this might be a weird edit.
Right.
because that happens
Yeah,
sometimes, you know,
yeah,
where did that beat go? You know, sometimes,
yeah,
and I just couldn't catch the rhythmic structure because it was inconsistent with other parts.
mm,
I may have brought that up with him
okay,
for clarity, but Frank, you know, was not usually very helpful with that, you know, because he didn't. Sometimes he didn't figure it out. He just said, "Do this,"
yeah,
you know, and play this here, you know, and okay, now put this on it. Okay, now take this and do this. You know, it's like, are you familiar with the piece approximate?
yeah,
That was like a playground for him because we used to perform that and it was all X for note heads. And we would do it sometimes where you pick the notes
yeah,
unless a particular note is written, or sometimes we would dance it,
that's, yeah,
you know, or we'd all have to sing it. And it was hilarious. This was Frank, you know, but he would take bars from that and just plant them in other pieces of music. Like if you listen to Inca Roads, that's
yeah,
all from approximate,
yeah, yeah,
you know. So I think there was pieces of that in there may have been pieces just strewn into the Roxy record in places, you know what I mean?
sure, sure.